Okay, so this is the first in a little set of effectively lectures that I'm going to go through with you and get you to do them in your own time, and then we'll do some activities and apply some of the things we learnt together. But it's also just going to allow you to use some of that class time to work on your multimodal presentation and troubleshoot any problems that come up. So we're still looking at the Crucible, and we're drilling down now. We've done our context. We know the plot really well. We've looked at characters. We're going to look at some more nuanced things that are a little bit harder to research and a little bit more complex and difficult to access. And we're going to look specifically at realism, mostly at tragedy, at human experience, and also the audience or the reader as an element of that human experience. I've put the quote there, "I have given you my soul, leave me my name," by John Proctor, because A, that's one we find super easy to remember, but B, it's a part of that tragic message that we get through this play. Key part of that tragic ending or sad ending. So we're going to go through some history on the tradition of tragedy, the dramatic tradition and conventions and where they came from. And the idea of that is that it's going to build into your understanding of the how. So by thinking about which elements of tragedy has Miller chosen to keep, which has he adapted or changed, and which has he not adhered to at all, you can start to think about why he would do that, to what end, and answer those how he shapes meaning questions. So we're going to start way, way back, and in this image with his finger in the air, we've got Plato, and then in the blue, we've got Aristotle. And Aristotle wrote some essays called On Poetics, in which he really laid down the law for what he thought a good tragedy was. And he differentiated it from an epic and from a comedy. And he told us that tragedy is a form of drama, exciting the emotions of pity and fear. So if we're thinking about our rubric just in the back of our head all the time, as I know we are, we're thinking of that wording, emotions arising from experience. And for the audience, those emotions, if it's a successful tragedy, should be emotions of pity and fear. He says its action should be single and complete. So we want to follow one cause and effect, one set in motion, one action of one protagonist all the way through to its tragic end. Subplots, twists and turns, they're a no-no. We want to create that suspense with that one single and complete action all the way through. Tragedy should be presenting a reversal of fortune involving persons renowned and of superior attainments. So usually they followed a king or someone sort of like an elite athlete, someone well off, someone above the common man, and then saw that fortune reverse to the very unfortunate. And it should be written in poetry and embellished with every kind of artistic expression. So those were his rules. He differentiated a tragedy from a comedy or an epic by saying that it contained incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to interpret its catharsis of such emotions. So here we're going to say that catharsis is a purging or sweeping away of pity and fear aroused by the tragic action, by that single action. So any play which was composed in a way that it was supposed to cause a catharsis for the audience, that it was supposed to put them in a position in which they could experience intense fear and experience pity safely and allow those emotions to bubble over. And then because it's a play and they walk away at the end, remove those emotions, then that is something that he would call a tragedy. That is what is required of a tragedy, that causing of catharsis. So the human experience, the emotion arising from the experience of engaging with these plays, should be catharsis, the removal of pity and fear. So you can think about for yourself whether you believe that's true or not true of the Crucible. And of course, we're reading it, so that's a bit of a different experience, but that's okay. You can imagine what's going on. We've got very detailed direction, we've got the authorial intrusions, all those things that help build, or not, depending on your evaluation, that catharsis. He says, in order for the tragic hero to arouse these feelings in the audience, he cannot be either all good or all evil, but must be someone the audience can identify with. However, Aristotle thinks if he is superior in some ways to the common man, then the tragic pleasure is intensified because you're seeing someone better than you succumb to something that you yourself might succumb to. His disastrous end results from a mistaken action, which in turn arises from a tragic flaw or tragic error in judgment. Often, the tragic flaw is something that people refer to as hubris. It's an excessive pride that causes the hero to ignore a divine warning or to break a moral law. Now, we don't have any really divine warnings, but we do have a pride that causes Proctor to cheat. And we do have a pride that causes him to think he knows better than Elizabeth. And we've referred before to Elizabeth as his moral compass. So if we think about that and we think about those really clear, explicit warnings that Elizabeth gave all the time about a woman's scorn and about Abigail and how dangerous she could be and that she wasn't going to stop, then in a sense there was a pride that prevented Proctor from listening to those warnings that set this whole thing in motion. It has been suggested that because the tragic hero's suffering is greater than his offence, the audience feels pity, because the audience members perceive that they could behave similarly. So they can picture themselves making the same mistakes, which causes an empathy and a pity. Moving away from Aristotle and toward Shakespeare, and there's a little comic here that says Shakespearean tragedy bingo, which you might want to play one day. We've got someone is stabbed to death, there's a fatal mix-up, someone is poisoned to death, a ghost, someone is strangled to death, someone makes a poor decision, someone is stabbed and poisoned, someone poisons themselves, a lot of poison going on. Basically, it's that joke, everyone dies, right? So Shakespeare was influenced by Aristotle and he did adopt some of the same things, but he moved away from some of the rigid ideas from On Poetics and some of the must-have elements of tragedy. And if you're familiar with Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, any of those really classic Shakespearean tragedies, you'll already be thinking to yourself that these don't quite fit the bill. They don't match those rules. So whilst tragedy previously followed single figures along a single course of action, as we just spoke about, Shakespeare began to play with things like subplots and twists and have a little bit more fun with his plot structure. Shakespeare also began to mix prose and poetry on stage, which would have been a big no-no for Aristotle. Poetry was the only and best form of dramatic communication. And he favoured the creation of a spectacle, a drama, a sensation, often resulting in this extreme kind of violent showdowns at the end of his plays. And the Greeks would have found this quite confronting and quite crude. Well, we've got to remember that Shakespeare was playing to a really diverse audience. So he had all walks of life in the globe all at once, and they responded to spectacle and drama. And, you know, he was commissioned and paid to write plays that would sell. So he was also reacting to what people wanted to see. And that's going to be true of Miller, that he was going to have to react by making plays people would want to see. That's how writers make their money, yeah? So we needed to evolve away from the very strict rules of Aristotelian tragedies. And Shakespeare started us on that road. Shakespeare also started to mix the tragic, the comic, and the romantic elements all together. So if you get a play like Hamlet, you've got the tragic demise of Hamlet himself, but in there's some very comedic scenes. There's some very funny characters that are purely there for comic relief. And there's a few romantic elements and subplots going on. Lots of subplots happening. In fact, enough subplot that you can just cut out whole subplots, and people often do, in order to make it a less confusing play. But Shakespeare played with all those elements. And so we see the tradition starting to evolve. here's the basic structure of a Shakespearean tragedy, and you can have a look at this yourself. And we've already done plot structures, but I think we basically have a fairly similar structure happening in the Crucible, especially if you think about it as a text that you read as opposed to see. We've got a lot of exposition, and that comes in through authorial intrusion and a note on the characters and those sorts of things. There's an inciting force, an error of judgment, there's a crisis, which we have in the court scene, the tragic force, so the force that pushes Proctor to his death, the moment of final suspense, that conversation between Proctor and Elizabeth, the catastrophe, which is the death of the protagonist, and then we get the glimpse of restored order, which is not just that acceptance of Elizabeth on stage, but it's also when we read the play, the note that comes afterwards that tells us what happened to some of our characters a bit later on. So especially as a written play, it very much follows this Shakespearean tragedy, and I think that's interesting for a modern script. So a little bit of history. Again, sort of in the 1900s, the tragedy really started to take a dive. It wasn't a very popular genre anymore. And some playwrights decided to try and revive it, particularly in the 19th century and into the 20th century, and it evolved into what was called the problem play. So while social debates in drama weren't really new and trying to stage social problems, what became called the problem play was distinguished by this desire to confront the reader with the dilemmas experienced by the characters. So I'm going to say that again. The problem play aimed to confront the viewer, the audience, or if you're reading it, the reader, with the problems faced by the characters on stage. Just thinking about that and thinking, does that apply to our text? So the earliest forms of the play were found in France, and they sort of covered social issues, sometimes looking at morals, sometimes looking at emotions and sentiments. And then it evolved in Norway with this playwright who I've got an image here, Henrik Ibsen, who wrote A Doll's House, which some of you are familiar with. And he gave this real emphasis to topical social issues, concentrating on the moral dilemmas of a particular character. So the restrictions on women's lives in The Doll's House. He did one called Ghosts, which was about sexually transmitted diseases. He did one about greed in An Enemy of the People. And this was really popular, so it was picked up on by other 19th and 20th century playwrights. So the problem play itself had its own conventions. It usually has a tragic ending. The driving force behind the play is the exploration of some social problem. Just got, for example, here, alcoholism, prostitution, and the characters themselves embody and are used as examples of this general problem. Frequently, the playwright views the problem and its solution in a way that defies or rejects the conventional view. Not surprisingly, some problem plays have aroused anger and controversy in audiences and critics. Ibsen is credited with helping revive the genre of tragedy through the creation of this problem play. And actually, he was influential on Miller himself. So he brought tragedy back to a relevance within the 19th and 20th century. It had a role now, it had something to say. I've got this little quote from Bernard Shaw, who wrote problem plays, and he said, "Only in the problem play is there any real drama, because drama is no mere setting up of the camera to nature. It is the presentation in parable of the conflict between man's will and his environment, in a word, of problem." So Bernard Shaw saw the work of the problem play as really important in setting up a situation that perfectly explored and confronted the reader with tensions that were heightened, and that, yes, they were embodied by characters that maybe bordered on caricature, but that were really affecting for those watching. And for him, that was real drama. Of course, that's slightly self-aggrandizing because he himself wrote these kinds of plays, but passionately did so. Conventions of the problem play, they usually preferred naturalism or realism, so having real people, real speech patterns, very much not poetry, everyday settings and clothings. They use an exposition to set the scene. They build suspense gradually, often towards a secret that is the crux of the plot. The secret may be known by the audience and other characters, but it is usually kept from one of the central characters. The revelation of this secret sets the main character on a path to their demise from which they cannot return. The problem is usually only solved through the destruction of the main character, hence the tragedy. Now I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about what we end up with through this history of tragedy, which is referred to by some as the tragic vision. And I've just put this little sculpture of Aristotle there, who appears to have no vision because obviously his eyes are stone. I'm going to speak it to you so that you really have to listen in and make some notes. It's just forced active listening, sorry. So in tragedy, there seems to be a mix of 7 elements that help establish what we may call a tragic vision. We need a catastrophic conclusion. We need for that conclusion to seem inevitable, particularly to the audience. It has to frustrate them because they want so to intervene, but they can't. There's nothing that can be done. It has to occur ultimately because of the human limitations of the protagonist. The protagonist is to suffer terribly, more so than whatever their limitation or their flaw deems kind of necessary. The protagonist's suffering may seem disproportionate to his or her misdeed, which is what I was trying to get at just now. The suffering is usually redemptive, bringing out the nobler side of them or the nobler aspects of humans and humanity. And the suffering is also redemptive in bringing out the capacity for accepting moral responsibility. And this is where I really start thinking about the Crucible, is this sense of moral responsibility. So let's talk about that a little bit. So I've just got this article here and it says, despite the inevitable catastrophe, the human limitation, the disproportionate suffering, the tragic vision also implies that suffering can call forth human potentialities, can clarify human capacities, and that often there is a learning process that the direct experience of suffering engenders. I'm thinking here about the rubric, and I'm thinking anomalies in human experience, that through great suffering, there are actually these positives and these potentials. They give some examples of different texts in which we see this learning process. Then they say, indeed, tragedy provides a complex view of human heroism, a riddle mixed of glory and jest, nobility and irony. The madness that is wiser than sanity, the blind who see more truly than the physically sighted, are recurring metaphors for the paradox of tragedy, which show us human situations of pitiful and fearful proportions, but also of extraordinary achievement. I'm going to say that again. They show us human situations of pitiful and fearful proportions, but also of extraordinary achievement. Does that apply to the Crucible? For tragedy presents not only human weakness and precarious security and liability to suffering, but also its nobility and greatness. Tragedies do not occur to puppets. While the tragic victim is one of the recurring character types of tragedy, and we have a list of mainly women that Shakespeare's killed off, tragic protagonists more frequently have an active role, one which exposes not only their errors of judgments, their flaws, their own conscious or unwitting contribution to the situation, but which also suggests their enormous potential to endure or survive or transcend suffering, to learn, feel, and to attain a complex view of moral responsibility. They go on. The terrifying difficulty of accepting moral responsibility is an issue in Hamlet, Sophocles, Oedipus, Tyrannus. It is an issue in all tragedy. even when the moral status of the protagonist is not admirable. Whatever Aristotle's hamartia, it is not necessarily moral culpability, although it may be, as we see in Macbeth. So this flaw is not always a moral problem with the character, although it may be. Tragic vision insists upon man's responsibility for his actions. This is the essential element of the vision that permits us to deny access to its precincts or puppets who, by definition, have neither free will nor ultimate responsibility for their existence. Tragedy acknowledges the occasional disproportion between human acts and their consequences, but imposes or accepts responsibility nevertheless. In this way, pain and fear are spiritualized as suffering. As Richard Sewall suggests in Us, the Vision of Tragedy, the conflict of man and his destiny is elevated to ultimate magnitude. So I think that's really applicable to our ideas of paradoxes of human experience, the paradox of having to go through something tragic, something terrible, something that causes suffering, in order to find in people their highest potential for good and worth and nobility. So you can think about that in relation to the characters that each other presented and which one of those might fit that paradoxical but tragic hero description, the tragic vision. So Miller himself has some words on tragedy, and obviously this one was good enough for someone to make it into a life hack quote. The closer a man approaches tragedy, the more intense is his concentration of emotion upon the fixed point of his commitment, which is to say, the closer he approaches what in life we call fanaticism. And fanaticism is obviously something that Miller's critiquing, making a social critique of in the Crucible. But how does that fit with Proctor? The closer a man approaches tragedy, the more intense is his concentration of emotion upon the fixed point of his commitment. What does that mean to you? What is the fixed point of his commitment? Is that a religiosity? Is it a social expectation, a social rule? What is he concentrating that emotion upon that leads to fanaticism? Maybe pause there and see what you think and note it down so we can discuss that later. He goes on to reflect on what the appeal of tragedy is and what a true tragic hero must be. And in classic Miller style, he's a bit wordy, but we'll do what we can. He says, quoting, "As a general rule, to which there may be exceptions unknown to me, I think the tragic feeling is evoked in us when we are in the presence of a character who is ready to lay down his life, if need be, to secure one thing, his sense of personal dignity." And I'll refer you back to that quote about the name earlier. Here's a big one, bear with me. In the sense of having been initiated by the hero himself, the tale always reveals what has been called his tragic flaw, and we've discussed this, a failing that is not peculiar to grand or elevated characters, nor is it necessarily a weakness. The flaw or crack in the characters is really nothing and need be nothing, but his inherent unwillingness to remain passive in the face of what he conceives to be a challenge to his dignity, his image, or his rightful status. So this is what Miller thinks that flaw really is, that refusal to be passive. Only the passive, only those who accept their lot without active retaliation are flawless. Most of us are in that category, but there are among us today, as there have always been, those who act against the scheme of things that degrades them. And in the process of action, everything we have accepted out of fear, of insensitivity or ignorance is shaken before us and examined. And from this total onslaught by an individual against the seemingly stable cosmos surrounding us, from this total examination of the unchangeable environment comes the terror and fear that is classically associated with tragedy. So here he's talking about, where does our fear come from in tragedy? It comes from that individual shaking what we take for granted, shaking the stability that we hold on to and questioning it. Do we see that in the Crucible? Where do we see that? What makes us feel that? More important, from this total questioning of what has previously been unquestioned, we learn. And such a process is not beyond the common man. In revolutions around the world these past 30 years, he, the common man, has demonstrated again and again this inner dynamic of all tragedy. The tragic right is a condition of life, a condition in which the human personality is able to flower and realise itself. The wrong is the condition which suppresses man, perverts the flowing out of his love and creative instinct. This sounds very McCarthyist to me, critique of McCarthy. Tragedy enlightens, and it must, in that it points the heroic finger at the enemy of man's freedom. The thrust for freedom is the quality in tragedy which exalts. The revolutionary questioning of the stable environment is what terrifies. In no way is the common man debarred from such thoughts or such actions. So this is part of a bigger argument that Miller makes about the new tragic hero being taken on by the common man, that it doesn't need to be a king, it doesn't need to be a noble, that actually the common man is capable of these things also. And maybe our modern audience connects more to that common man. Maybe that's a change made on purpose. So some questions for you, and I'd expect to see answers in some form, so written, typed up, but I want to see them, please. Which elements and traditions of tragedy does the Crucible adhere to? So going back through, having a look from Aristotle, Shakespeare, through to our Norwegian problem plays. What has Miller taken and used? How significant are the elements of tragedy to the meaning offered by the Crucible? How big a role do they play? So that's an evaluate question. And what is the purpose of the tragic elements of this play in shaping audience experience and understanding? What do they do for our reader, for our audience? How do they make meaning? How do they shape experience beyond just meaning? How do we experience that meaning? And how do the tragic elements play into that? I found this, someone's thoughts about tragedy and the Crucible. And they say, Susan Abbottson, she says, another modern tragic hero, the play's central protagonist John Proctor, must confront his own culpability through his past affair with Abigail, the girls whose accusations have initiated the witch trials. Mapping the typical progression of so many of Miller's characters from betrayal and or guilt through to the embrace of active responsibility, Proctor comes to an existential self-awareness that gives his self-sacrifice to preserve his own name and the names of others a timeless relevance. A person's name, for Miller, is the trope by which characters convey a sense of their own moral and personal essence, and the loss of a name can only be devastating. So just a reflection on that line we looked at earlier and what that actually means and how that plays into the tragedy and that progression that Proctor goes through, that learning that Miller was talking about before, in which they embrace the active responsibility, they move beyond the passive and embrace the active. Some of my thoughts. I think the Crucible offers a fairly traditional, if slightly modernised, tragic hero, John Proctor, and adopts many of the conventions of the problem play in order to create for the audience a cathartic and deeply haunting exploration of the tragic flaw. But I don't think this flaw is of individuals. It's of societies that hold in too high regard social constructs at the expense of others. I think the play explores the experiences of those who, in attempting to challenge social truths, set themselves on a path of unavoidable destruction, but who do so willingly anyway. In its construction, it offers the reader the opportunity to engage in the same human experiences as Proctor, as the suspense created takes the reader on a journey from emotions of anger at betrayal, guilt at inaction or complicity, to acceptance, and then attempt at restorative action. So I think we go on that experience and that journey with Proctor. I think that just as the individual in this play, individual character, embodies the anxieties of the state, government, or religious bodies, the reader takes on the anxieties of those individuals. The use of tragic elements is crucial, I believe, in allowing Miller's parable to continue to speak to audiences, regardless of their knowledge of Salem or of McCarthyism. So you're probably wondering by this point, that's a lot of information, what am I going to do with it? Well, I want you to know that I think that for all texts, regardless of the question you are asked, you're always able to talk about form and style and genre and things like that. So regardless of the essay question, you'll be able to incorporate some analysis of the structure and of the dramatic conventions of your text as a part of the way that it makes meaning. In this text, I see that certain elements of tragedy are easily linked to specific ideas from the rubric. And here's a few examples. So the plot structure of the Crucible provokes an emotional experience of pity and fear and catharsis for the viewer, mirroring the feelings of catharsis sought by those in desperate situations, like those of the Salem witch trials. So linking to emotions arising from experience. I think the construction of the tragic hero, John Proctor, provokes a connection between audience and character, allowing us to share in his human experience or individual experience of persecution, wrongful judgment, guilt, and acceptance. So there's an individual human experience that we become a part of there. And knowing he was a real individual, I think that adds to that. Miller himself reflects that he was keenly interested in the tragedy of the common man, the experience of trying to discover and assert one's identity and freedom in the face of total constraint. To do this, he had to select and create a situation which emphasis was placed on one such common man, with such power that the audience spends much of the play desperately wanting to intervene, but completely powerless to do so. For me, that causes that pity and that fear. Any examples that you find, techniques, devices that are used to enhance that pity and fear on behalf of Proctor would contribute really easily to an analysis of this tragedy of common man. So there's some links for you there. Feel free to go on and make your own. Maybe share them on Classroom. Your turn. So what I want you to do with all this is to just synthesize, consolidate, trim off the knowledge you don't need, hold on to the knowledge you do need, and compose a paragraph in answer to the question, how does Arthur Miller utilize conventions of a tragedy in order to communicate key ideas about individual or collective human experiences? And in that paragraph, I want to see the analysis, so narrowing it down, just answer. It can be several paragraphs if you want. Extended response, I don't mind, but really focusing on picking those examples so that we can perform the analysis, really hone those analysis skills. How does Arthur Miller utilize conventions of tragedy in order to communicate key ideas about individual or collective human experiences? Off you go.